In this tutorial, I'll demonstrate how to use my thick paint compatible nature brush pack for Corel Painter. These brushes are thick paint compatible, which means that they can use the thick paint feature in Corel Painter 2021 and later. So I've gone ahead and created a new canvas here, and I've created a thick paint layer to paint on, and I've just filled the canvas layer with this sky blue. These brushes are great for painting nature scenes that have some thickness to the paint. I'm talking happy trees and mountains and things like that. So the first brush that we'll start with is Hazy. I'll select white, and I'll paint a test stroke. I'm just going to let it build up like this. Now if you look over in the Layers panel at Visible Depth, here's where you can make that paint look thicker. Now this is obviously way too thick. But if we reduce that a bit, it gives the paint a little bit of texture. Now you don't have to use thickness when you paint with these brushes. For example, if this is something in the background, then you may not want it to have any thickness at all. So let's leave visible depth at 0 for this layer. I'm going to clear that layer out. And let's just go ahead and give this layer a name. We'll just call this Hazy Clouds. I'm going to sample my sky color, make it a bit darker, and let's put in some haziness up here at the top. Now really what I'm doing is just creating sort of a gradient effect. But once we put in a lot of colors here, it's all going to start to blend together nicely, and it'll give a lot of definition to the sky. You can use lighter pressure, and the mark will become fainter. It'll also become a little bit smaller. So something like that looks pretty good. I'll make my color a bit darker again, and shift the hue toward indigo a bit. We'll make it even darker up here at the top. Then we'll select a more cyan hue, make the color light, almost white, and we'll put in some of that down here at the bottom. And this brush does have a little bit of color variability. If we look in the color variability panel, here's where you can control the strength of that. And if you don't like that it varies the color a little bit, you can just turn all of these off. I'm just going to use lighter pressure just to fade this up into the middle of the sky here. And you can see that we get a sky that looks kind of hazy. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Now I'm going to select kind of a cream color like this. And let's define sort of a horizon area here. So these are really, really distant clouds in the background. We'll just kind of use lighter pressure just to fade them down into nothing. Let's create another thick paint layer. We'll call this Cloudy. I'll keep using this cream color here, and I'll select Thick Paint Compatible Cloudy. I'll paint a test stroke with this brush, and you'll see that there are two colors in this stroke. Those colors are defined by your main and additional color. So for my main color, I'll keep using this cream color, but I'll click on my additional color, and I'm going to sample one of the background blue colors. Now when I paint a stroke, it's going to fit in better. And here I'll just add some definition to the tops of these distant clouds. You want to let the brushes do the work for you, so I'm just doing really spontaneous strokes and just letting this stuff happen. That way I don't have to think about individual cloud shapes. I can just put it in. As you can see, if I just do a big cloud up here in the sky, it's a particle brush, and so its particles are spinning and moving around randomly, so you're not going to get the same stroke twice. I could use lighter pressure to put in smaller, fainter clouds in the background like this, or heavier pressure to make bigger, thicker, fluffier clouds. I can also make my brush size smaller, and I can get some really thin clouds that are off in the distance like that. Or I can make my brush really large, and I can get really puffy areas like this. It's a very versatile brush. I'm going to go back a few steps here, and I just want to add in some more clouds using a smaller brush with this cloudy brush. I want some of these to be a bit sharper. And if you want, you can sharpen up the edges of some of these as well, just to give them some more definition. But just try to follow the natural shapes that are being created here. I'm going to select my main color to activate it, and I'll sample one of these shadow colors. I just want to be sure to put in a little bit of that on these floating clouds. Let's create another thick paint layer. Now you don't necessarily have to paint with thick paint layers. You can also paint on default layers with these brushes, but you'll have more control over the thickness of the paint and the way that the paint interacts if you use a thick paint layer. For example, a thick paint layer will let you control the visible depth. So at any time I can go in here to, let's say, my cloudy layer, and I can increase the thickness. Of course I don't want to do that, but that's one of the benefits to working this way. So that new layer I'm going to call Mountain, and the brush that we're going to select is called Mountainy. I'm going to select a dark blue-gray color like this, and I'm going to draw a nice mountain shape and just fill it in. You can use lighter pressure with this brush, and when you do that, it's going to pick up some of the paper grain. You'll also get some of the dab stencil. If I go to the shape flyout, here we can see dab stencil is set to flow map. I can change that to something that looks more rocky, like clouds. And now when I use lighter pressure, you can see that I get that texture. If I use heavier pressure, then I'm just going to fill it in. So I'll just go ahead and fill in the whole thing here. If you want, you can make your brush smaller. Then you can put in some smaller, finer details along the edge here. I think I'm happy with that shape. Now if your mountain gets too big, you can always move it down with the layer adjuster. I think I will do that, so I'm not covering up all my nice clouds there. Next, I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency for that mountain layer, and I'll continue using that Mountainy brush. I'm going to make my brush bigger, and I'm going to make my color lighter, and I'm going to start my mark outside of the shape and then pull in like this. And when I do that, I'm able to pull in some paint, and then it kind of fades out and blends in. So we'll do that here on these little peaks here as well. You want to think of each peak as being divided, so there's a highlight and a shadow side. So right now I'm just doing the highlight side, and I decided that that's this side. But you want to use lighter pressure as you taper your stroke off. And just light pressure down here near the bottom just to kind of blend it all together. And we'll make that color just a little bit duller, a little bit darker, and we'll just fill in more of that mountain on the shadow side. I'm going to shift my color more toward indigo, make it pretty bright. Let's just do a test here and see. Now this brush is using color variability as well, so if you don't like that, you can turn it off. I think it looks nice. It adds some flavor to the brush. Now let's select the brush called Stony. I'm going to sample this highlight color here, and I'll just make it brighter and more saturated. Maybe something like that. I'm going to make a bigger brush, and I'm just going to use really light pressure, as light as you can go. But what I want to do here is just add some texture to this rock. That texture is coming from a dab stencil, which is set to this desk paint texture. If I press harder, then I'm going to cover that up entirely, so I just really want to press light here. I'm also getting some of my paper grain, so I can set that paper grain to something else. Let's say simulated wood grain. I have the scale and contrast pretty high on this as well. Now I'm getting a little of each texture. And if you want, you can go back and forth with these colors, and you can bring in some of the shadow color again, just using light pressure. These two brushes work really well together to give you a nice mountain, stone, or rock effect. I'm going to sample that color and make it even lighter. I'll shift the hue again toward kind of a magenta color. We'll just put in a few tiny, tiny little highlights here. Let's create a new thick paint layer. I'm going to disable Preserve Transparency. I'll name this new layer Forest. I'll select the brush called Foresty. I'll sample the shadow color from my mountain and make it darker. And I'll just draw in some distant pine trees like so. Go ahead and just fill this in all the way. I'll create another thick paint layer. We'll call it Forest FG for foreground. And just make it a bit darker. And we'll put in some of that overlaps that other layer. Now the beauty of working this way is you can just kind of freestyle this and make it up as you go along. And at any time you can change things around. So if I find that I have way too much sky here and I want to shift some things up, I can select all of these layers, select my layer adjuster, and then just use my up arrow key just to bump them up like this. And if I want to, I can move some of that forest down if it's covering up too much of the mountain. I'm going to create a new default layer, and we'll just use this just to kind of fill stuff in. I'll name it Water Base. I'm going to select the rectangular selection tool, and I'll just select the bottom section of the canvas. I'll sample my sky color, and I'll just fill it with that. I'll press Ctrl D to deselect. And I still think I want to shift some stuff up even more. This is composing as you go along. And I'm going to transform that water base layer just to make it a little bit taller to fill that space. On that water base layer, I'm going to go to Effects, Focus, Soften. I'm going to soften the edge a bit so it's not too sharp. I'm going to free transform it just to make sure that it bleeds off the edge of the canvas entirely. I'm going to right click on this layer, and I'm going to convert it to a thick paint layer. I'll need to rename that layer. I'll turn on Preserve Transparency. Then I'm going to select the Watery brush. I'm going to sample some of these colors from the sky. And with heavy pressure, I'm just going to paint side-to-side strokes like this. I'm going to make my pressure lighter as I go into the background. This is an amazing water brush. I'm going to make my color lighter now. Shift the hue towards cyan. And again, lighter pressure in the background, heavier pressure in the foreground, then you'll get that nice perspective effect. Now we could even put in all of this stuff if we want it to look like there's some reflections on the water. Just sampling those colors and then just putting them in. Let's add another thick paint layer. I'm going to disable Preserve Transparency. I'll call this Shore. Let's just use the Mountainy brush to put this in. I want to sample the darkest color that I'm using and just make it even darker. Let's do kind of a perspective thing like this. I'll enable Preserve Transparency. I'm going to make my color just a bit brighter and saturate it a bit more. And I'm going to pull from outside of that shape in and just create some texture here on the land. And I'll just use lighter pressure just to go over that whole thing and just kind of mix those colors together. Next, I'll go to the Pebbly brush. I'm going to make my color brighter. I'll also need to select my additional color and make that kind of a similar color. I'll do a test stroke. You can see I get something that looks pebbly like that. You want there to be enough contrast though so that you get a nice three-dimensional effect, so I'll go with something like that. And in the foreground I'm going to use heavier pressure, and in the background I'll use lighter pressure. I'll change my color a bit. Just put in some more. I'll sample some of these bluish colors from the water. Near the water we'll put in some of those with little highlights. Let's create another thick paint layer. I'll call this Stones. I'll disable Preserve Transparency. I'll select the Rocky brush. I'll sample one of these colors from the mountain. I'll add a little bit of visible depth. And I'll paint a test stroke, and you can see that it creates this kind of thick blob of paint. If I use lighter pressure, then I'll get a thinner line. If I use heavier pressure, I get a thicker line. So I just want to kind of sketch in a shape here, do the outline of it. I want there to be a front and back side to this stone. This will be a really tall standing boulder. And on the light side, I'll go ahead and just fill that in. Might even zoom in a bit so we can see this better. Just making sure it's nice and filled in here. And then on the shadow side, we'll select our main color and get that shadow color. And we'll put in some of that. Now this brush has kind of an interesting feel to it. If you use lighter pressure, then you're going to get paint that kind of covers the paint underneath. But if you use heavier pressure, then you're going to mix in a tiny bit of paint, but you're doing mostly blending. And so if you go between light and heavy pressure, you can kind of blend this paint together and build up these different forms. Takes a little bit of practice. So for example, I can turn on Preserve Transparency. I can build up different colors in this rock, put in some shadow color on the back side here, and just brighten my color here and there to add in some highlights. Use your imagination and think about all these different shapes that this rock has. That way it doesn't just look like a cone. And if you want, you can add additional layers if you want to just be able to paint without it blending. I'll zoom out of that. Now that was a lot of work to put into one rock, but it gives you a really interesting look. Tone down that reflection on the other side just a bit, just to make sure that it looks nice and dark. I might add one more thick paint layer, just to make sure there's a really nice crease separating these two sides of the rock. Zoom back into it a bit. I'll merge all those stone layers together with Control E. It's okay if they're converted to a default layer because I can right click on this and change it back to a thick paint layer. I'll turn on Preserve Transparency. I'll select the Stony brush. Now I can add in some other little textures on top of that. I'm going to go to that shore layer. I'm just going to paint over some of those stones to make it look like there's a shadow being cast. We'll zoom out a bit and see what we have here. I think that looks pretty cool. I'll just need to name that layer, that way I know what it is. I'm going to disable Preserve Transparency. I'm going to create a new thick paint layer. Name it Ripples. I'm going to select the Ripley brush. I'll sample this light cream color from the sky. If I do a test stroke, you can see it's kind of a bristly brush. I get something like this. So what you could do with this is you could draw little water ripples and things like that. So let's say the water is going to be shallow as it approaches the land. I'm going to go to that shore layer. I'm going to add a mask to it. Select black. I'm just going to use one of my custom brushes, which is digital airbrush, but you can use the default digital airbrush as well. And I'm just going to mask the edge of that to fade it into the water. I'll go back to the ripples layer and the ripply brush and that cream color from the sky. Now let's have some water ripples going around this rock here. I have a few just kind of dancing and playing here and there. But again, let the brush do the work for you. You can use a blue on the opposite side, that way it looks like some of this stuff is in shadow. And maybe now that I'm looking at it like this, maybe this is actually a river. So if we want the water to look like it's flowing, let's create another thick paint layer. Call this Flow. I'll select the Flowy brush. I'm going to need to put this flow layer beneath that stone, but make sure that it's above the shore and the water. Sample that cream color, and I can simply pull strokes like this to create a directional flow. That creates some interesting movement. Sample one of those blue-gray colors, and we'll add a little bit here in the foreground as well. Let's add another new layer. I'm going to call this Tree, and the next brush that we'll use is called Splashy. Now normally you would use Splashy to create splash effects like this. I'm pulling curved strokes in the direction that I want the splash to go. Lighter pressure creates little fine droplets of mist. Heavier pressure creates a bigger, broader splash. But what I'm going to do with this brush is select a darker color here. I'm just going to use it to put in some trees. So I can kind of pull leaves down like this to get kind of a directional effect like that. I'll turn on Preserve Transparency. And I'm going to select kind of a light blue-gray color like this. And we'll just put in some highlights on the leaves here. I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to create another thick paint layer, turn off Preserve Transparency. I'll name this Stormy. I'll select the Stormy brush. Let's select kind of a stormy color here. And if I paint with this brush, you can see it moves around a lot on its own. It gives me this nice stormy effect. There's some color variability in this brush as well, so if you don't like that, you can disable it. I'm going to move the stormy layer down beneath the mountain, and we'll just have one big stormy cloud up here at the top. You could blend other colors into it if you want to, but I think that looks pretty good. I'll go to the shore layer. I'll create a thick paint layer above that. I'm going to name this layer Foam. Normally I'd use this Foamy brush for sea foam, but we could also use it for some water ripples. I'm going to sample one of these light blue colors. I'll paint here on the mountain so you can see what I'm doing. Depending on which direction your pen is pointing, that's going to control the direction that the flow goes for these different shapes. So if I point my pen up, it flows up. If I point it to the left, it flows to the left. This is only going to work if your pen supports pen tilt or bearing. So I want to keep my pen kind of sideways here and just use really light pressure. I'm just adding in these nice little ripply things. Put in some lighter ones over here if we like. You can always change the composite method of that layer to screen if you want it to blend in, and you can reduce the opacity. Let's have something kind of subtle like that. I'll create a new thick paint layer up here at the top. And the last couple of brushes don't necessarily fit into this scene, but let's try Snowy. I'll just sample my light color from the sky here. And with Snowy, you just pull down strokes like this to get snow. That gives you a nice snow effect. And you could have the snow flow in all kinds of directions like that as well. We won't have any snow today in this scene. Now let's take a look at the last brush, which is called Frosty. If we paint with Frosty, you can see it adds this really nice frost effect. Let's put some on this rock here. I'll select that stone layer. I'll right click on it, choose Select Layer Content to put a selection around it. Press Ctrl-Shift-H to hide the selection. I'll go back to that new layer. And I can paint this frost on top of the stone. It stays trapped within that shape. Put some on the back side as well. Lighter pressure creates glitter. Heavier pressure creates big, thick chunks of ice. Let's go ahead and defrost that. So that's a look at what all the brushes can do. Let's go ahead and wrap this painting up by painting with a few brushes that aren't in this brush pack. I'm going to select my digital airbrush, and I'll create a regular layer above that mountain layer. Name it Mist. I'm going to sample this light cream color from the sky, make a big brush. I'll need to deselect that active selection from the rock with Control D. And then I can paint right here to add some mist. This helps separate the mountain from the trees that are in front of it, and it helps that mountain look a bit more distant. You could also use the blue from the sky as well, if you want to set that back a bit more. But as you can see, this mountain's not set in stone. Let's go ahead and add some mist in between these forest layers. That helps that foreground one look like it's going off into the distance. We'll go to that forest foreground layer. We'll add a layer in front of that. Add a little bit of mist to the bottom edge of that as well. I'm being very careful not to paint onto the sky, but if you wanted to, you could use a selection to make sure it stays only on that forest layer. I'm going to preview my artwork in grayscale using the Windows 10 grayscale preview, and this will help me visualize the contrast in my painting. I think I might want this stormy cloud to be a bit darker, so I'll go to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors. It's okay if we commit that to a default layer. I'm going to reset all the values here. Just make it a bit darker. Turn off grayscale preview so we can see how that looks. It's a subtle change, but I think that helped. Now if we want to, we can go in here and we can play with the thickness of this paint as well. For example, I could make the tree thicker. You can see those leaves get much thicker. I think that looks kind of neat. If we go to the ripples in the water, we can add an edge to those, but I think they look good pretty flat, so I won't have any edge on them. There's that stone layer, which we can add texture to if we want that to look thicker. Add a little bit of thickness to that. There's the flow layer, which I don't think really needs much thickness, but maybe a little bit looks kind of interesting. The foam layer doesn't need any. I don't think the shore layer needs any either. If you wanted to, you could thicken up the water. That makes it look kind of crispy, so I'm going to keep it just flat like that. These forest layers can get a little bit of definition by increasing the visible depth. You don't want to do it too much though if you want them to look distant. You can see we can really bring out the mountain here and make it look super thick if we add visible depth. But I want it to look distant, so I don't want to add too much detail there. You can also get the best of both worlds by duplicating your mountain layer. The topmost one I'll convert to a default layer. I'll hide it for a minute, go back to the mountain beneath, and reduce the visible depth. Make the top one visible again, add a mask, select black, select my airbrush, and then anywhere where the thickness is too strong, you can just kind of airbrush that away, and then you can keep only some of the thickness. So I do a before and after, you can see. I got rid of some of those shadows that I didn't like. I'm going to go to this mist layer here, and I'm going to set the composite method to overlay. I think that looks a little bit better. We have this cloudy layer here, and I don't think that it helps it too much to increase the depth on that, so we'll just keep that flat. Same goes for the hazy clouds. I think we're getting pretty close to a finished painting here. One thing I think I'd like to do is to go to this flow layer. I'll convert it to a default layer, and I'm going to add a mask to that, and use my airbrush just to airbrush out some of that, just to blend it in. Might even do that with the ripples layer as well. As a finishing touch, we can select all, do copy merged, and then paste in place. We'll just group all of our other layers here together. And if I hide them and then hide that merged layer, you can see that basically I just flattened all my layers down to a single layer while still keeping those layers in case I need them later. Name that layer merged. Then I can go in with my blender brushes and blend stuff together if I like. I'm going to use Smooth Knife Blender. I might just kind of soften the edge here on this mountain. I'll select the diffuse blur blender. And I can soften the edge of that mountain as well, just to set it into the distance. Just using very light circular strokes like this. I can just lightly blend on it, and that just fades it back into the distance. Same goes for those clouds if those are too sharp. Or really anything, we could do that on the water as well. Just be careful not to do it on your foreground. As you can see, you can smudge your rock out like that, and that wouldn't be good. And I think with that, we have a finished painting. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration of the thick paint compatible nature brush pack for Corel Painter. You can download that from my website at aaronrutten.com.